Welcome to This Must Be the Place. I'm your host, Alo Galinsky. Each week, I'll uncover what's happening in Sonoma County, diving into the hidden gems and quirky corners. I'll be interviewing some of our local legends, as well as people you didn't know you need to know, all through the eyes of a craft beer enthusiast living in wine country. Join me as we explore one sip, one story, and one adventure at a time, and together we'll find out why this must be the place. Peanuts, the beloved comic strip created by local legend Charles M. Schulz, is celebrating its 75th anniversary. First appearing on October 2nd, 1950 in 7 newspapers nationwide, Peanuts was a work of art that was a profound reflection on the human condition. Over the next 50 years, Charles Schulz crafted 17,897 Peanuts comic strips, writing and drawing everything himself. He only took one break during the strip's run to celebrate his own 75th birthday. So, on this 75th birthday of the Peanuts gang, it is only fitting that we have a Schulz expert to discuss all things Charlie Brown. Benjamin Clark is a curator of the Charles M. Schulz Museum and Research Center. He leads the team responsible for caring for and interpreting the legacy of Charles M. Schulz at the museum and around the world. He's also the co-author of the book Charles M. Schulz, The Art and Life of the Peanuts Creator in 100 Objects. Good grief, Benjamin. What an incredible legacy to be responsible for. As a curator and expert on Schulz, what do you consider your most significant responsibility?
That's a big question. I think it's really about keeping that legacy alive, and also to be honest. Schulz was a pretty open guy when it came to things like interviews and things like that. And I think, and also most especially in Peanuts, he really put himself into it. And so I think being fact-based, we don't do hagiography, we really talk about the man and present him as he was. And I think that's an important part, that because we can all identify with somebody like that, and who had his challenges and had his ups and downs with things, and just like any of us do. And so I think that's an important thing to do, but also just to keep working, keep researching, keep digging, that his life was so rich, and what he made was just incredible. And the more time I spend with it, the more I learn. So I think that's probably the most important part of what I do.
Sure. And what has a curatorship taught you about Schulz? As you said, you spent a lot of time kind of with this man and his legacy and preserving it. Has your experience changed a preconceived view you may have held about him prior?
Before I was hired here, I wasn't really like a Schulz expert or anything. So I was a fan. I knew he was the guy behind Peanuts, and I, was kind of aware he grew up in the Twin Cities and lived in California. But, that was about it, besides what I knew or absorbed, I guess would be a better word, through reading Peanuts, growing up in the 80s and the 90s too, reading the strip and in newspapers and reading some of the old paperback collections and stuff. I still didn't have like a super strong body of knowledge about who he was. So I didn't really have a lot of preconceived notions really before I really had to dig in and get to know him very well, very quickly. And so one thing that's impressed me was, for someone who was, I think, by nature very private, was just how open he was, though, when he gave interviews. And he gave interviews to almost anyone who would ask. And he prioritized those newspapers. He'd say yes to some little newspaper in Arkansas that carried Peanuts, but he'd turn down like CBS Sunday Mornings. He's like, I don't want to fly somewhere and have a TV crew in my face. So, he just, but, finding those interviews now can be kind of tough. That's why we still find new ones occasionally that we hadn't had recorded, because he would just, some editor would call him up on a Tuesday afternoon and he'd give a little interview over the phone, and it was printed in that paper and it never went anywhere else. and so that is something that really impresses me about him, for someone who's I think his instinct was to probably not do that, but he knew he needed to.
And that speaks to kind of his level of wanting to promote while not over promoting, or not, putting himself in positions he wasn't comfortable with or wasn't, I guess, willing to do.
Yeah.
And that just speaks to kind of, a man and how he wants to carry his legacy and see it going forward. One thing I'm curious about, what do you think his genius or Schultz's secret sauce? Don't say that 3 times fast, folks. Schultz's secret sauce was.
For one thing, he, becoming a newspaper comic strip artist was really his only ambition in life. From the age, he says, he said by the age of 6, like he's telling his parents, I want to be a newspaper comic strip artist. And he'd already given it some thought, like this is what I want to do. And he's one of those kids he was an only child, and he just spent all of his time drawing and just drawing on any blank piece of something that would take ink. He was drawing on it. And so he was like a student of the comics. He read them just religiously. He pored over them. He got there were 2 big papers in St. Paul. There were 2 in Minneapolis, and his dad they would subscribe to the 2 in St. Paul, and he'd buy the 2 in Minneapolis. And so every Sunday he had 4 giant comic sections to read. And back then, some of those comic sections are like 30 pages, and they all have different comics. And so he and his dad just pored over them, and they'd talk about the characters and what's happening and what's going to happen next. And, he spent a lot of time with it. So he was really an expert by the time he's really putting his own ideas out there. So I think part of his genius was the fact that he was well versed in what comics were and are up to that point. And then he wasn't really bound by that. He was able to bring his own creative ideas and his own way of doing things within that. So it was, absolute genius.
I think that's really impressive. And as somebody personally who I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up, to have that kind of, know from age 6 that you're a comic fan and you want to pursue that and you like to draw and you spend your life getting to that point, that only shows his mindset and dedication to everything that came after that. And Charlie Brown, as much as Charles Schulz is a legacy guy, Charlie Brown is a legacy character. And he's been around for a long time. And I want to ask you, what makes us still relate to good old Charlie Brown after all these years?
Well, Charlie Brown, he loses, he doesn't win very often. And, we all identify with that because losing is way more common of an experience than winning at anything. And I think we all identify with Charlie Brown because he has a tough time. And
the ultimate underdog.
Yeah. And if you talk to most people believe they are also having a hard time more often than not. So I think that's why we can all kind of look at him and laugh. And because, if we laugh at him, we're really, we're also laughing at ourselves. And
right.
That helps. It helps,
Laughter makes the world go round.
Yeah.
And there's been Charlie Brown, of course, and Lucy and some of these kind of legacy characters, but there's also been the introduction of some diverse characters like Franklin. And I want you to, answer me this. What did the introduction of Franklin, some other diverse characters, how did it impact both kind of the strip and broader culture?
Within the universe, within the strip, if you could drop yourself in as a character in the strip, adding like Franklin in particular, it didn't change that much. It's just another new kid. But it made a huge impact out here in the real world. Especially for like Black American readers, they saw someone who looked like themselves. And there are, I think of Rob Armstrong, a Black cartoonist today who saw that as a kid and was like, whoa, there's a Black kid in Peanuts. Maybe I could be a cartoonist too. Cause he's already, a fan of the strip and he grew up and became a professional cartoonist. And, it's so interesting that, there was even, at the time, people noticed. It was a big deal. And even from the floor of Congress, a congressman from Missouri, a Black congressman, his name is escaping me, but he mentions it in a speech, that Franklin, this Black kid's been added to Peanuts. And it's kind of like, wow, that's incredible that even in Congress they're talking about Franklin within that first year. This isn't recent.
That's
history.
Really great.
This is back a ways. And so pretty incredible. Yeah.
Sure. And another interesting thing to note that adults rarely appear in the Peanuts universe. I'd love you to dig into the archives a little bit and let us listeners know, what do the archives reveal about Schulz's thinking on depicting adults or not depicting them? And how do you think he might have intended them to be perceived in all of that?
Yeah, it's very deliberate. It's very, very deliberate. You go back to the really early days, the first couple years of Peanuts, you'll get some off-panel speech balloons coming in from off-panel, a mother of a character saying, time to come eat or, whatever. And there is kind of a famous run of Sundays, I think is in May of 55, when Lucy enters a golf tournament and we see grown-ups from like legs, we just see a lot of grown-up legs. And that's kind of, Schulz, he said, I don't put adults into my strip because they wouldn't fit. Like physically, they said they'd have to stoop down to be able to be seen because he drew it, where the kids are the full size of the panels. And, I think he would also say that, adults kind of break the fantasy of what Peanuts was and what the strip is, because these kids and Snoopy, they have their own universe going, and the way kids always do, and adults just have no place in it, and so he left them out, and he was a genius for doing it. We look at some strips. There was a strip that was, he said it didn't last very long, but that was because he only caught the very end of it as a kid. It was a strip called Smatter Pop, and by a man named Charles Payne, and it was like this long-suffering dad and his son, and it's basically a kid strip, but there's a dad that's a main character also, and the dad is always like hunched over in these panels in all these awkward positions, and even the way Ernie Bushmiller drew Aunt Fritzy in Nancy, it's just like, you get like this floating head in the corner, and then Nancy and Sluggo are doing their thing, and it kind of doesn't work, and it doesn't, and but he was like, no, it doesn't work for me. So there's virtually, it's 99.9% adult free in Peanuts. So,
and he stuck to it, which is another, it's committing to go in one way and saying, this is the style I'm going for, this is the message or story I'm trying to tell.
Right, because sometimes we need those restrictions to really unleash the creativity. Just being told you can do anything, it's not helpful sometimes. For him being told you have to draw dailies, they have to be in 4 equal panels, that's a restriction, but it really did unleash some creative approaches. And I think his choice to exclude adults was part of that too.
Sure. And speaking of how he was telling his stories, there was a piece that came out after he died in 2000. There was a media scholar, Robert Thompson, on the PBS NewsHour that compared the 50-year story of Charlie Brown and his friends. It's like a classic 19th century epic, and he called it arguably the longest story told by a single artist in human history. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that, Benjamin? Do you agree?
Yeah, in 2000, sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. It's not true any longer. There's a cartoonist named Russ Myers who draws a cartoon strip called Broomhilda, mm-hmm. and he has now surpassed Schulz and Peanuts as a single artist, strip. So he's now drawn more than Schulz's 17,897 strips on Broomhilda. So he might have it now, but I'm not a Broomhilda scholar, so I can't tell you if it's a single story.
Not yet.
But yeah, Peanuts, I think it is one story. We have the story of these kids and this crazy dog, and they evolve, it changes over time, but really it does. It has a beginning and a middle and an end, and I guess that counts.
Speaking of a beginning, middle, and end, let's wrap up a little bit about Schulz's legacy. And I just want to ask you, how did Schulz single-handedly build one of the most beloved and influential franchises in history?
Yeah, that's, single-handed is kind of hard to, kind of yes and no on that. Okay. The strip itself is just him. The strip itself is, he wrote every line of dialogue, every joke, every drawing, all of it is him. The only thing he would allow anyone to do on his strip was paste on the copyright statements and that's about it. He had some help really late in the strip with like the adding the zipatone, which is like the little pattern stuff to make the gray tones for like, upholstery on the furniture and, leaves on trees, that kind of stuff. But even that was under his direction, put that here, and they did, and that was kind of it. But everything else, the all the merchandising and licensing and adaptations, that was other people. And he wasn't an animator. He was not a sculptor who could turn them into toys and dolls and whatever else. But he was very particular about who he would work with. He wanted people he liked, and he wanted people who were already making really great things. Whatever they were making, they needed to be great at it. And so he found people, or people found him. Actually, he never sought any of that out. But there were people as early as 1954 wanting to adapt Peanuts into animation, and he'd meet with them, but then he was like, "Nah, I don't want to do that. I don't want to work with these people." And until he met Lee Mendelsohn and Bill Melendez, and kind of went, "Okay, I think we can work together. These guys get it." That was the important thing, is that people understood what Peanuts really was, and in his mind, it's the strip. As long as it's rooted in the strip, it'll be good. And so when Connie Boucher of Determined Productions comes to him and says, "Oh, I want to make a calendar," and okay, let's see what you got. And it's like, "Wow, it's a crazy design, but I like it. Okay, I think you kind of understand what I'm doing here." And then she says, "Well, I got an idea for a book. We call it Happiness is a Warm Puppy. I like the strip you did. What if we publish this book?" And Schulz is like, "Well, I'm not in publishing, but okay, let's just try that." And of course, it's one of the all-time greatest sellers that year. So it's it's these other people who were part of that picture as well. But for him, it wasn't just business, it was personal too. He had to be able to work with these people in a way that he could feel good about, and that he respected what they were doing.
And I'm really getting the sense that's true for kind of all art mediums, whether we're talking filmmakers, musicians, comic strip artists. You really want to build that foundation of people that, if you're going to build this legacy, work and have this foundational thing, you want people to trust in and have the same mindset to carry that forward once you're gone or once you stop working on it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you care about it,
Right.
If you really, if it's part of you, yeah, I think so.
So bringing the focus a little bit more local here, tying this back to where we are, setting this podcast, Sonoma County, a twofold question for you. What's Charles Schulz's legacy? How is he remembered in Sonoma County? What does he mean to the county? And also, are there reflections of Sonoma County in the Peanut strip?
Oh, there's all kinds of things that, Mr. and Mrs. Schulz were very generous in his lifetime, and Mrs. Schulz has been generous, since his passing. So there's lots of Schulz things, when you go places, you'll see their names on the walls of a lot of different places, and whether it's tied to the arts or helping others or the environment, you'll see their name a lot. And then also, if you see the word anonymous, that might be them too. in several many places. So they were very generous here because they loved Sonoma County and the people here, and this was their home. This was the right thing to do, was to support the things you believe in and want to help. And that's been part of their ethos of their philanthropy. That's my understanding, at least, and my observation. So yeah, that's definitely true. And then, and Sonoma County loves them back. You drive around, you're going to see, Charlie Brown and Snoopy statues everywhere. You're going to see them, people make, build Snoopy mailboxes, and,
Right. I've seen it with my own two eyes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Murals on the side of buildings that include the characters, and, that we love them back. And it's pretty great to be from, Snoopy's hometown,
Absolutely. So talking about the museum a little bit and your curatorship, why don't you tell our listeners what's the most unusual or surprising item in the museum's collection? Maybe they're both the same thing, but tell us a little bit about what you think about the most unusual or surprising item there.
Ooh, that's a great question, because, every museum's got something weird, every museum does. you know. But this museum, our collection is not that old, and it's just about this one guy and this thing he made. So it's a it's a very tight focused collection. So a lot of, weird stuff hasn't really snuck in. But I say that one of my favorite weird things we have is we have, let's see, I was doing an exhibition and I was talking about Schulz's kind of like daily routine and how he would park over at his studio and then he'd walk, it's maybe a block down to the ice arena where there's the cafe. It was still there, the warm puppy cafe where he would eat his breakfast. And where the museum sits, there were two little houses here at one point in time, and he, in his lifetime, and he talked about how he loved stopping to say good morning to these two dogs that lived at one of these houses in the yard there, and how those dogs would look up at him with, such love in their eyes because he always had dog treats. And so he would share little doggy biscuits with them and go about his morning, and how that was just for him, an important part of his day, his routine. And I was sharing that in this exhibition, and I was like, he always carried a duffel bag, like a canvas duffel bag. Because, when he'd go down to the ice arena, he carried a change of clothes because he would go down there and, he was very active. So, he played hockey regularly and would skate for exercise and stuff. And so he always, he'd carry a little change of clothes with him. I was like, don't we have that duffel bag in our collection? And because, a lot of his personal effects at the studio when he died were boxed up because the museum was already underway at that point. It was being built. And so they boxed up his stuff and brought it into our collections, but it hadn't really been deeply processed yet. And so we knew what we had, but that was kind of it. And so anyway, we pulled out that. It was like, oh, sure enough, here's that duffel bag. Oh, great. We open it up, and inside the little side pocket were dog biscuits. They were still there. I couldn't believe it. And I was like, wow. I was like, these are the dog biscuits he's talking about in this, when he's kind of talking about his day. And of course, we couldn't keep them in the collection, but there were two, like this. These are the ones he put in the bag. Like, this is incredible. Charles Schulz touched these dog biscuits. And so what we did is we made molds of them and actually made replicas of these exact dog biscuits. So when we display the bag and tell that story, we could put the replica dog biscuits with them. So we have in our collection replica dog biscuits of the exact ones that Charles Schulz left in his duffel bag.
There you go, folks. Get down to the Charles Schulz Museum and check out these replica dog biscuits, along with every other piece of very cool history that I'm sure they have.
Yeah.
Benjamin, I do want to ask about, the museum engaging with a new generation of fans. There's a lot more media that's come out since the comic strip, as you touched on, movies, TV specials. I know Apple TV's done a great job of resurrecting some stuff with the Peanuts gang and Snoopy. So, how does the museum engage with that new generation of fans who may be more familiar with those newer forms of media than the original comic strip?
Yeah. You've named it all. Yeah, we definitely explore how it's being reinterpreted and adapted in those Apple TV Plus specials, which are fabulous. If you haven't caught those, they're really fun. The Apple team and Wild Brain, they all do a great job of studying the strip and looking for the stories. Craig Schulz and who's the son of Charles Schulz, and then his son Brian have worked on a lot of those as well. So the Schulz family has had direct input on a lot of those, which is really fabulous. And the other thing is really great about the strip itself is how easily it adapts to social media. Those 4 equal panels are perfect for, flipping through a carousel on Instagram or on TikTok or on Threads or Blue Sky. I mean, whatever you're into, the strip really works on social media too. So younger fans can definitely, find and follow us there on your favorite social platform, and you'll get a little dose of peanuts every day, which really is a good thing.
Very cool.
If you have to spend time on social media, then go at least
spend it with Snoopy and the gang.
Yeah, just Put something nice in there, huh?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now, if you can only get the algorithm to make sure those things showed up in everybody's feeds, but that's a longer discussion for a time that we don't have right now.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Just like, comment, and subscribe.
That's right. So, Benjamin, what do you see as the biggest opportunity for the Peanuts brand moving forward in your very professorial and unique opinion?
Yeah. The opportunities for the brand, I mean, I technically don't work for the Peanuts brand. So
Sure.
this is just to be clear about that. So I do not speak on behalf of the brand Peanuts. But, I think they're doing an incredible job, just finding that younger audience where they're at and just keeping Peanuts visible. So many of, comic contemporaries of Peanuts are being forgotten. And, it's not very many kids today who know who, like Beetle Bailey is. Beetle Bailey started like 2 weeks before Peanuts.
I'm one of those kids who knows. I'm a big kid who knows who Beetle Bailey is.
Yeah. Even, Dennis the Menace, he's, even a little, just like a year younger than Peanuts. And, it's kind of, people are forgetting. And Pogo, which came out like a year earlier, a lot of people don't know who Pogo is anymore, even though he had, Pogo was huge when it was at its peak. I mean, just enormous. So, it's interesting. So I think Peanuts the brand is doing a great job just keeping this 75-year-old, bit of pop culture, visible. And Schulz himself is the one who's keeping it relevant because he created this thing with universal ideas and ways that people can connect with it. So it's
and themes that ring true in daily life.
Absolutely for everybody worldwide.
Yes.
It's so interesting. I mean, I've been to Japan and I met Japanese fans who were shocked to learn that Peanuts was from the United States. They thought it was Japanese. Yeah, they thought it was Japanese. And I think some of that has to be attributed to the Shuntaro Kanagawa. He was like the national poet laureate of Japan, and he's the one that translated the Peanuts strip. So I'm told it's an incredible and faithful and incredible translation. So I'm sure that makes it even better for those fans. But yeah, but it's still Schulz. It's still his universal stories.
So I'm going to leave here with a big one for both you, Benjamin, and for our listeners out there. I'm going to pose this to you first, and then everybody listening to us out there. A Charlie Brown Christmas, or It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown. What's more iconic and why?
Ooh, you love a can of worms, don't you? Let's see here.
Nobody else is listening, just us. Right
sure. Okay, well, I do have an answer. So, those are the first two, or actually the first and third animated special. Charlie Brown All Stars, which is in between it, is about baseball, and it's also it's a very neglected special, and it's very good. I think people should track that down.
Ever the Diplomat.
Yeah. So, but I do have it between the two. I have a clear favorite. Mine is Great Pumpkin. Is my very favorite. Christmas is great. It's a masterpiece. I have an exhibition up right now because this year is the 60th anniversary of the Charlie Brown Christmas special. We even got to interview a member of the children's choir who was brought in to do the music pieces.
That's really cool.
So very cool stuff. It's incredible. It changed television. It changed animation. It's still a classic today, and I know people love it. But it is not my very favorite. My very favorite is Great Pumpkin.
Why?
It just is. It just is. It just is. Yeah, it just is.
Well, to our listeners out there, maybe this can go spark some social media debate and conversation around Charles M. Schulz and the Snoopy Peanuts gang. Charlie Brown Christmas, or It's the Great Pumpkin. You let us know right in the comments of this podcast, which one is your favorite and why. And Benjamin, I just want to say thank you so much for being on with us today. Happy birthday to Charles Schulz. And I hope everybody gets out to the museum to celebrate his legacy and their love of Peanuts before long.
Thank you, Allo. Thank you very much.
Cheers. How do you carry on a comic strip's legacy while forging your own creative path? As Peanuts marked its 75th anniversary, we sit down with Mary Valencia-Shyne, a senior artist at the Schulz Studio and the creator of the new young adult graphic novel, You and Me on Repeat. She'll share what it's like to honor a comic legend while building her own artistic career, bridging the classic and the contemporary. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, thanks for having me, Aloe.
It's really fantastic to have you on here to speak to somebody who has kind of a local and broader perspective of the comic world at large, as we have spent a whole episode celebrating the legend of Charles Schulz and the Peanuts crew. So let's
Totally.
just dig right in here. You work with the Schulz Studio, and I'd love for you to explain to us what the Schulz Studio is, and as their senior artist, what your responsibilities entail.
The museum and the studio are both on the same campus, and we're sort of, I feel like the museum is about preserving his art, Schultz's artwork and legacy, and the studio is about carrying his legacy forward into sort of contemporary culture. So we are in charge of basically how the artwork looks on product, and we're also in charge of, any new content or media that's being made under the Peanuts IP.
Very cool. How long have you been associated with Schulz Studio?
Oh, geez, I think it's been a little over 7 years now, which is wild to think about.
7 years. So you're definitely deep in it, and it seems like it's really fun. I'm sure being an artist is a lot of work, but also you take a lot of joy in it. I'd
My
love you to
God,
kind of
yeah.
walk us through a typical day in the life of a cartoonist at the Schultz Studio.
Totally. Yeah, it's like a dream job for a cartoonist. Basically, a day in the life is I do work from home most of the time. I do go in once a week. So the routine is a little different if there's a commute baked in, etc. And then I go onto my computer, I log in, and then I'm checking my email, making sure there's nothing urgent to respond to. And then I'm going and working on what we call product approvals. And we have a system where we go in and licensees, who are people who have licensed the Peanuts IP, they submit their project. So if they're making a t-shirt, they make a project in this system and we have to look at it and make sure they're using the artwork properly. So that's about half my job. And then the other half of my job is art projects. I do a lot of what we call custom art, which is like if Sparky didn't draw a pose, but a licensee wants a character to be doing something that we still feel is like in the spirit of Peanuts, we will create that artwork in the studio. A lot of it is created from like archival material, but there is some like, drawing involved. And then we also work on, at least for me, I work on the Apple TV Plus content, which is, Camp Snoopy, Snoopy show, the specials, like the one and only Marcie. And that's mostly reviewing animation, reviewing character turnarounds, and if need be, redlining things, which basically means we see something in the animation that doesn't really look like how Schultz would draw it. We screenshot that. We then draw over the top of it with red ink to show them how Schultz would draw it. And yeah, and then I kind of like do any other art task that might pop up. Like I recently did a Peanuts mural for our local NAACP branch in Sonoma County, and that was really cool. I did that with a bunch of my other coworkers. Yeah, I've also been like practicing with Sparky's nib a lot because I don't know, I think it's really valuable to have that skill of still working with the nib and ink because obviously we're a contemporary studio. Most of what we do is digital, but I think it's important to still know how he worked and the tools that he used.
I mean, it's always important to kind of honor the classics and then figure out the ways to bring those old and classic images and ideas and thoughts forward. And you mentioned a little bit about your work with the Apple TV Plus content. Can you tell us a little bit about how you approach adapting those classic characters for new animated content and a more modern audience?
So I think what we say with stuff like this is we always want to start with the strip. When we're like brainstorming narratives or anything, we really want to, instead of like creating a new idea whole cloth, we instead want to like find like a 4-page little gag that he did and maybe expound upon that. So starting with the strip is key. And just knowing the characters, so that necessitates reading the strip a lot of the time, which no complaints on that. Yeah, just like knowing the characters really intimately, looking at the strip, reading the strip, just staying very in tune with the source material.
I can imagine how important that is. And also, just as you said, kind of getting inside that character's mindset and thinking, well, what
Mhm.
would they do if this was taken one step or one panel or frame further, maybe five steps or panels further? So it sounds like a
Totally.
fascinating process.
Yeah, yeah, and like Sparky said, like all of these characters are sort of facets of him. So you're sort of thinking like, how would he direct these characters forward? How would he do something? And that's very different from like when you're working on your own work where you're thinking about how would I want to do something. The studio work is about like trying to get into Schultz's frame of mind and figuring out he would do how he would do it, you know?
Right. And having immersed yourself in the Peanuts world for, you said, like 7 years now, are there any characters you particularly enjoy working with? And why would that be the case?
I think I like Sally because she just has no reservations about calling out BS and everything like that, and just the absurdities of the adult world. I've really come to love her. I also really like Spike because he's sort of like Snoopy's wayward brother. He's like if Snoopy completely messed up his life, and I like that that has a place in Peanuts, which usually everyone. I mean, the strip is very wholesome, but that's not entirely what it is, right? There's many shades inside of the Peanuts comic strip.
Absolutely. And we talked to somebody before you who was talking about his favorite Peanuts characters. And to all our listeners out there, I encourage you to, sit with your comic strips this Sunday morning. Our podcast releases on Sunday. Sit with your comic strips and coffee. Maybe think about, who do you relate with in the Peanuts universe? Is there a character that you really glom onto? And if so, leave us a comment in the comment section of this podcast after you're done listening. Let's pivot a little bit to talk about the legacy of Charles Schulz and just everything he's done. I'd love you to talk about what you consider the legacy of Charles Schulz on contemporary cartooning.
I mean, I feel like you can just see it in the way a lot of people draw cartoon characters, kind of having like the bigger heads with the smaller bodies, the eyes and the nose completely lining up with the ears. That's so classic Schultz. Yeah, I feel like I see it so prominently in so many American cartoonists, not even syndicated cartoonists, but people who are doing graphic novels as well. So I think, oh, I was just on a panel with this graphic novelist whose name I'm completely blanking on, but she writes the Nat books, which are like a popular middle grade book, and you could so see Charles M. Schulz's influence on her work. And she definitely like says he's her biggest influence. And I just think that so many people grew up looking at his artwork, it kind of becomes how you think about how to draw things, you know?
Absolutely. And, you are a steward of his artistic legacy. Are there certain ways in which you balance creating new art while honoring the spirit and quality of his original work?
Definitely. I mean, like I said, the work that I do at the studio, I try and as much as possible like remove my own like artistic ego from it. I think of myself as sort of like a muscle that is being guided by the legacy of Schultz, by my impression of what he might have thought. But yeah, I mean, inevitably it kind of creeps into your artwork, right? Like my own artwork is heavily manga influenced. I would say that previous to working at the studio, that was my main influence, and you couldn't see a lot of American comic influence in my work. But that's changed just because, I'm using that same muscle to do the studio work as to do my own work off the clock. So
I was a musician at one point. It's improvisation. You have your own style, but then you've learned classic styles, you've learned theory, you've learned history, and
totally.
everything you've gone into studying the art, you
Yeah.
mix and match what you like and your creative style in with that. So it's kind of the same as maybe a jazz musician or somebody who's learned the theory, but then mixing their own style, their flair, their notes into what they like to perform and produce.
100%. Yeah, I feel like the way that I draw eyes now can be very sparky. The way I draw hands now. I mean, I was just talking about this at this con in Sacramento, but I was saying how I used to kind of like belabor drawing hands because I'm like, I gotta get these completely right. But I feel like seeing the like imitating how Sparky draws fingers that are just like little loops, bloop, 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 has maybe be a lot more fast and loose with hands, which in turn they look kind of, I don't know, I think they look better.
Now, let's talk about your background a little bit. You spent a decade in publishing in New York City before you earned your MFA from the Center for Cartoon Studies. Why did you make the leap to becoming a comics artist? Was there something that really grabbed at you, or just, this urge to delve into comics?
Yeah, well, in publishing, I was working in digital production, which is so I was creating ebooks. I wasn't on the editorial side, and I definitely did still want to do something creative, but at some point, I was gonna like write YA books, but that didn't pan out in my early 20s. And then I kind of turned to comics. I'd always been drawing comics, and when you're working a full-time job. You have time at the end of the day if you're not going out socializing all the time. And I decided to use that time to start drawing comics, probably like, I don't know, towards the end of my time, I was working at Penguin Random House. And I was basically working on, I mean, I'm doing this exact same routine now. So I was basically just preparing for my life. I would work my job from 9 to 5, and then I would go home, eat, and then from like 7 until 11 I would work in the studio. And I think I hit like 27, and a lot of my older peers in publishing were like, "Oh yeah, you're about the age when I went to grad school," which, obviously shows you a lot about the demographic of publishing. But I was like, "Oh, okay, well, I've been at this job for a while. I'm not really sure what the next steps are. I don't really have a huge desire to be a manager or a director. So maybe I will go to grad school and, try and get serious about this comic thing." And I was going to my very first show as a comic artist still while I was working at PRH. And it was the show called Rhode Island Press Expo. It was like associated with RISD. It's called RIPE. And there I found a school called the Center for Cartoon Studies, which I'd never heard of before. And I was like, oh, okay, like maybe this could be it. Because I knew I wanted to draw comics, and I knew I really just kind of needed like that time to work on the skill. And I applied and left my New York life behind for to pursue the art of comics. And then after the Center for Cartoon Studies, after I graduated, I was very fortunately put in touch with my now boss, Paige Braddock and Donna Almendrala, by my then professor Jason Lutz. So it all kind of worked out. I'm really lucky in that respect because comics can be a sort of punishing field.
Well, it's fantastic that it worked out for you so well. And while you said that writing graphic novel or writing young adult novels, I should say, didn't pan out, you did just come off a book tour for your young adult graphic novel. I'd love you to tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about it. It's called You and Me on Repeat. It was released this year, and it features a time loop romance.
Yes.
Shed us into what inspired the story. What themes did you want to explore with it?
Oh, yeah. So this one I've always loved. Time Stories, Back to the Future is my favorite movie, and Groundhog Day was my dad's favorite movie. And then at the time when I've been working at the Schulz Studio for like a few years, I think, and I read this light graphic novel called All You Need Is Kill. It's a manga, and it was a time loop. And I think that one, reading that was like, okay, I've seen this done a few times before, and this is a cool way to do it. I kind of want to explore this genre too. And I was working with my agent, Anjali Singh, and we originally had a different pitch, but we decided we were gonna try something completely different because we're like, this isn't really the right time or the right market to pitch this thing. And so we decided to make something else completely different. And I had already been thinking about these time loop stories. So I pulled that idea out of the notebook, and it was during the pandemic. So I was thinking a lot about my hometown. I think the pandemic gave a lot of us time to reflect on like the past and who we have become over time. So I wanted to set it in my hometown. And I wanted to do that too because my hometown is in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, which
I
famously is like
thought I
where
caught
all.
a little bit of a Midwest accent in there.
Yeah, yeah, you can definitely, it comes out, definitely comes out. The northwest suburbs are where John Hughes movies are set.
Right.
And so I kind of wanted to hearken to those films, but obviously, those films are from the 80s. There's a lot of like outdated stuff going on there. So I wanted to kind of update it and give it a little sci-fi flair. And then that kind of came to be. And I thought, well, if I was when I was in high school, what would be the worst time to have a time loop? And for me, it would be like graduation day when I'm like ready to go, ready to leave. So
Right. And you
that's,
don't want to be stuck.
yeah, you don't want to be stuck. That's like the time when you're supposed to be progressing forward.
And
But
it's
these
interesting
characters,
because I have a recurring dream I've had for I don't know how long that I can't get out of high school English. I can't graduate, even though that was my best subject, is that I can't get out of my high school senior year English class. And that's a dream I have every couple of months. And that's my own, I guess, subconscious time loop as it may be.
Okay, so I had that same dream too. I recommend writing a book about your high school because now whenever I have that dream, I'm like, I know I graduated high school. I'm not supposed to be here. And I can like interrupt it. So, and I think my subconscious, it realizes I'm hip to its tricks now because now most of my dreams are about undergrad.
Ha. So you've moved forward a little bit step by step. So to all our listeners out there,
Exactly.
heard from Marcie-Shyne, if you have recurring dreams haunting your subconscious, go write a book.
Yeah,
Easier than
yeah,
it
process
sounds,
it through
right?
art.
Hey, that's the best kind of therapy is putting it out there through art, I believe.
Absolutely.
Now,
Yeah.
talking a little bit kind of about the cross section of your career with your book tour and your day-to-day passion, has working with Peanuts characters influenced your artistic process in any way, like in creating your own graphic novels and comics?
I mean, I'm writing a pretty different, I mean, it's technically an art and letter medium, so it's like Schulz's medium, but Schulz's medium was like the four panel, obviously different on Sunday, four panel syndicated strip, which is just different than a graphic novel. You have to have that punchline. You have to have such a fantastic sense of timing across just four panels, but for a graphic novel, you really, you do have to have timing. You have to make sure like the page turns are compelling and everything. So I think in that respect, a lot of that is more pulled from, manga artists that I
Sure.
was reading. But yeah, I mean, like I said, stylistically, I'm constantly putting little bits of Sparky's tricks into my artwork because he just had a really clever way of conveying different bits of anatomy. Obviously, he's the best artist of dogs of all time. So if I ever draw a dog, it's gonna have some Snoopy in it.
Always have a little bit of Snoopy in every dog. I think that's a familiar characteristic people can recognize too. And you touched on this as we start to wrap up here. Modern day cartooning is changed and it's moving beyond, I'm sure, the Sunday paper, the four panel, or the New Yorker magazine kind of style. Will you enlighten us a little bit? Where is modern day cartooning finding an audience, and where is that audience finding the art?
I do think a lot of people are finding stuff on Webtoons. And Webtoons has their unscrolled graphic novelizations now. I think a lot of people are finding things on TikTok, honestly.
Mhm.
Book Talk is like a juggernaut for understandable reasons, and it's been really great, especially for people who are self-publishing. And yeah, I'm actually probably going to be trying to sell my book on TikTok soon because I just want to see what happens. I like engaging with those platforms. So I think those are great ways of doing it. I think Goodreads is still a really big hub. A lot of people are on Storygraph as well. And I personally still the best way to discover graphic novels is just going into the library and seeing what the librarians have curated because they are geniuses.
Where can people find you? If people are looking to find more of your art, or a little bit more about you and your book, where can they find you, Mary?
Well, they can find me pretty much everywhere online under Marcie-Shyne online. That's my screen name. Shine is spelled with a Y. There's no Valencia in there because I still publish under my maiden name. I just recently got married, so the
Hey,
Valencia-Shyne is still
congratulations.
new. Thank you. I love it. I feel like my name is digivolved into something higher. Um,
Married, a book tour, man. You're really 2025 has been a banner year for you, huh?
Yeah, 2025 is popping off. Though I am very excited to just get to working on my second book in 2026.
Take a little of a breath first, soak in the Charles Schulz legacy as we get set to celebrate the
100%,
75
yeah.
years of the Peanuts comic.
Yes,
Mary, it
totally.
was really fantastic chatting with you. Thank you so much for being on our podcast. And I'm
Right
sure I'll
on.
run into you sometime soon as we're both Sonoma County residents.
Definitely, we got to get a drink.
Absolutely. All right, take care.
Good to talk to you.
You too. Bye. The interviews are done, which means I think it's time to crack one open. Interviews make me thirsty, and I want you thirsting for knowledge about some great beer, both local and not so local. Each week, I'll introduce you to a beer I find discussion worthy and explain the nuances of what makes it fantastic in my eyes and why you should give it a try. And just to keep it on point, I'll even try to make sure the beer reflects the vibe or theme of the episode. This weekend, your craft beer concierge is switching things up as he cracks open a root beer, a soda that evokes memories of birthday parties and big scoops of ice cream on top of this sweet treat. It was a favorite beverage of Charles Schulz, who also didn't drink. In fact, if you're as much of a Snoopy fan as I, you'll know that Schulz made sure Snoopy enjoyed his fair share of root beers in the comics. So I'm sitting here sipping away on this classic A&W root beer, encouraging all of you to go out and find your favorite and toast Peanut's 75th birthday the way Schulz would have, root beer in hand. However, if you might be looking for something a bit more grown up out there to enjoy with this episode, I surely don't think you can go wrong with a brown ale or perhaps a peanut stout. You can always send us a message to get some great local recommendations. A huge thank you to Benjamin and Mary for appearing on this week's episode of This Must Be the Place, and a very happy birthday once again to the Peanuts Gang. This Must Be the Place is produced by our friends at Pod Locally, an audio platform helping local voices connect to their communities. Don't forget to like, subscribe, or comment on all your favorite podcast apps, and visit the show notes for more information, links, and resources. Look out for our next drop on Sunday. Until then, I'm your host, Alo Galinsky, saying have a great week.